Welcome to Chapter 13, Anatomy of the Nervous System. We're going to learn about all the cool parts and structures to the brainstem, the spinal cord, but we will also talk a lot about the functions of all these parts too. So there is physiology involved as well. As always, here are your learning outcomes. By the end of the chapter, you should be able to answer all of these questions. We'll talk about every single one of them. And just a few more learning outcomes for you. Okay, so let's begin with a recap of the nervous system. The last chapter we introduced the different ways of classifying the nervous system. We talked about the central versus the peripheral nervous system. We talked about the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system. We also just talked about afferent versus efferent, right? So many different ways of classifying. What we're going to do in this chapter is we are going to start with structures in the CNS. So we're going to start with the brain, and then we'll talk about the brainstem and then the spinal cord. And then at the very end of the chapter, we will discuss the PNS. So let's get started with the central nervous system. Let's begin with some general anatomy of the brain. So the brain can be split up in many different divisions, and what I want to show you are the four main divisions, and then we'll talk about more specific structures within all four of those divisions. So first I want to introduce the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is pretty much what you typically think of when we talk about brain. It's this big area right here where it just kind of looks like a bunch of worm-looking structures. That is your cerebrum. So if you've ever heard the term cerebral cortex, your thinking cap or something like that, that's what they're generally referring to. So on the picture on the right, we're looking at an anterior view. So same thing, all of this big jumbled stuff, that's all the cerebrum of the brain. And that's where we're going to see all the lobes protected by those skull bones that you learn. So we had the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, right? We're also, and that's where we're going to introduce the frontal lobe, protected by that bone, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe. So we'll get to that in just a moment. Deep inside, you can't see with these pictures, but deep inside are some really important structures, and they help us with our sleep-wake cycles. They help us with our hormones, with our hunger and thirst levels, and with basically just communicating with different parts of the brain. That's called the diencephalon, and I'll show that to you in just a little bit. Another part of the brain that you can see in this photo is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is kind of this walnut, wrinkly looking structure right here. And you can see a little pieces of it on both views. And the cerebellum is going to be very important for communicating with the cerebrum, helping us walk and have coordinated movements. It's also going to help with balance and postural stuff as well. And then last but not least, we have the brainstem. And remember last chapter, I highlighted the importance of the brainstem being different than just the brain and the spinal cord. The brainstem area is this area right here. And this is what's basically going to help you stay alive. Yes, the brain does a lot of cool, neat functions, or the cerebrum, now that we're being more specific, does a lot of cool functions, but the brainstem, what you're going to find out is what helps control our breathing, our heart rate, our blood pressure, all of those things. So many different divisions. The cerebrum, the diencephalon, cerebellum, brainstem. And if I'm going too fast, nope, don't panic, don't worry. We're going to cover every single one of these on individual slides coming up shortly. So let's begin with the cerebrum. As I mentioned, the cerebrum is what we typically think of when folks say the brain. It's kind of that worm, squishy stuff that that you would think of or imagine. And as you can see in this picture, it's colored with multiple different colors, showing you the different lobes of the cerebrum. So let's talk about that first. In red, you can see the frontal lobe. So this would be the anterior portion of the head. And then back here, with the big P, that would be the posterior portion. So based on the anatomy of the bones, you know the bones of the skull, you know these lobes. We have the frontal lobe, in red. We have the parietal lobe in this kind of gray color. The temporal lobe would be down here by your ear, and then the occipital lobe in the back. Other parts of the cerebrum that you need to be aware of is there are hemispheres. There is a left cerebrum and a right cerebrum, or as you may have heard in the past from certain folks, left brain and right brain. And although anatomically they may look very, very similar, functionally they do work differently. They work together, but they have separate functions as well. For example, myself personally, I am extremely left-brained, which means the circuits in my left brain work a lot better than the circuits in my right brain. So what do I mean by that? I'm very, very good at numbers, at logic. I'm a big numbers geek. I like statistics and I like Excel. Although my wife helps contribute to making money and spending money, I have to do all of the bills in the house. I pay all the bills. I do all of the credit cards. I handle the mortgage. I handle the investments, everything. And the reason why, it's not because I'm a control freak. It's because I'm just really good with numbers. I enjoy looking and manipulating those numbers. Somebody who is more right-brained is very gifted in the more of the arts, music, kind of creativity, spatial thinking. And if you've ever heard me sing and you've seen my handwriting, you've seen my drawings, they're pretty terrible, right? So I have a very hard time being creative. I have a very hard time seeing outside of the box, right? And that's why I'm somewhat good at science, right? Science, a lot of times it's, this is what it does, okay, next. Not all the time, but with anatomy and physiology, a lot of times we don't have to think too far outside of the box with certain structures. So we have a left brain, or a left hemisphere is what we call it, and a right hemisphere. And I'll show you a picture of that on the next slide. We also have these cool structures called gyri, sulci, and fissures. And there's multiple different ways of saying gyri or gyri or gyrus, or all these different ways. Singular, it's called a gyrus. And you can see the spelling up here on top, underlined in red. And what a gyrus is one of these, what they call convolutions, or what I call worm-looking things. So, for example, in the picture, it's pointing to something called the pre-central gyrus, but this is also a gyrus, this worm thing here. This worm here, this worm there. Basically, it's kind of just these bump-looking structures all throughout the cerebrum. And if we have more than one, we call them gyri or gyri. Now, the indentations, or the deep foldings that create these worm-looking appearances, is called a sulcus. And you can see the spelling up here at top, underlined in green. A big one is called the central sulcus right here. There we go. And if we have more than one, which we do, we have another sulcus right here. We have sulci everywhere. And in plural, as I just said, sulci. And then what a fissure is just a really, really big sulcus. It's a really large indentation. And I'm going to show you an example on the next slide, as I just mentioned with the hemispheres. There's a really big folding or indentation that separates the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. So essentially what we have is just kind of this valley and mountains things. If anyone's ever been to a mountain chain or a mountain trail, what you have are the valleys or the folds or the paths in green, and then you have the mountains or the hills. And between all the different mountains are the valleys, right? And that's essentially what we're looking at in the brain. So the mountains, or the black structures, those are the gyri, those are the bumps. And then the foldings, or the valleys that indent into the brain that create these mountains, are the sulci. So with this slide, we can actually make out the two hemispheres. If you look at the image on the right, we're looking at an anterior view, so we're looking at somebody's face, but we remove their face and their skull. So what you're looking at here is actually the right side of the brain, and this would be the right hemisphere, and then obviously this would be the left hemisphere. Now, I'm going to show you more detailed pictures down the road, but there is a very big sulcus, a very big indentation that actually separates the majority of the left and right brain to the point where a lot of parts don't even touch each other. And once again, a very large sulcus is called a fissure. So in this case, it's called the longitudinal fissure, which separates the left brain from the right brain, or the left cerebrum from the right cerebrum. Looking at the lobes of the cerebrum, the first four you're already familiar with, you already know. And if you notice at the bottom of the page, there is a fifth one called the insula, and we'll get into that in just a moment. I'll have a picture for you on the next slide of what the insula looks like. But right now, let's just go in order and cover the four lobes of the cerebrum that you can see easily on this image in the upper right hand corner. So first is the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe has a lot of things going on for it. It is the primary motor area. So highlighting this frontal lobe in the picture, notice this is a very large portion of our cerebrum, and the primary motor area is basically, this is the area that helps us move. So as we move all those muscles, all those skeletal muscles that you learned, your biceps brachii, your rectus femoris, your gastrocnemius, all of that has to start in the brain. We talked about that with the neuromuscular junction, right? How does an action potential reach that synapse? How does acetylcholine get released? It all starts in the brain, and now we can go into a little bit more detail. Specifically, what part of the brain? It's here. It's the frontal lobe. And more specifically, actually, if you want to be very on point, it's actually this gyrus that I'll highlight in green for you. It's called the precentral gyrus. That is the main motor mover of your body. This is where the action potentials start, and they get sent down the brainstem, down the spinal cord, and out to your muscles. Now, there are other areas involved. The cerebellum's involved. There's also a planning part of the frontal lobe called the premotor cortex right next to it. It would be in this purple area right here that I'm kind of highlighting. That would be the premotor area. But generally speaking, a big portion of your frontal lobe helps you with motor movements. So, moving your arms, moving your legs, moving your torso, fingers, toes, neck, head, all of those things. Now, there is a specific part of the frontal lobe called Broca's area, and I'll highlight Broca's area in blue. It's kind of just right in this inferior aspect, but still towards the midline of the cerebrum. And Broca's area is still motor, but it has to do with speech. Has to deal with speech. So it actually helps you plan the words that you are going to speak. Also, it helps you with pronunciation, with pronouncing syllables and consonants and vowels and actually speaking. So if this area, excuse me, my Broca's area is not working right now, talking too fast. If this area were to be damaged, you would have a hard time speaking or articulating your words clearly. And a lot of times they call that Broca's aphasia or word salad, word garbage, where everything just kind of gets jumbled and mixed up. So that's all in the frontal lobe, all of those motor aspects. So what about all this area in the very front part of the frontal lobe, the anterior portion of the frontal lobe? Well, it's not all just motor. All this area in black I highlighted is a lot of things. This is your IQ. This is your intelligence. This is your logical thinking. This is also your personality. This is your morality, your conscious decision making. All of those things come in this frontal lobe. So this is what makes us smart. This is what makes us very intelligent. If you compare our brains to other animals' brains, even other mammals' brains, What they call this area is the prefrontal cortex, so it's the very front of the frontal cerebrum, and this area tends to be a lot heavily more developed in humans compared to other animal species. We have a lot more neurons compared to other animal species. So that's what makes us smart. That's what gives us the ability to drive a car and do math and have very, very unique personalities. Not that animals don't have personalities, it's just humans are very vastly different from one another. So that's all the frontal lobe movement and your individualness, your thinking, your smartness, all those types, those topics. Let's move on to the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe and the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe and the insula, pretty much everything else is going to be sensory related. So the frontal lobe is the only one dealing with motor function. Everything else, let me draw a big circle around the rest of these lobes, everything else is going to have some sort of sensory ability. So the parietal lobe, as you can see, is involved with something called somatic sensation. And what that means is touch. So when something is touching your skin, when you're stretching your muscle and you stretch a little too far, when your joints hurt, those kind of things, those messages, those action potentials go up the spinal cord, up the brainstem, and they arrive, basically they synapse or they terminate in the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is what helps put it all together and helps you understand, hey, there's something on my arm. Hey, my ankle is kind of bothering me right now. Hey, you're stretching your quadriceps too much right now. So it's the center for understanding touch sensation. Moving on to the temporal lobe, we have two areas. We have the auditory area, auditory, audition, meaning hearing, and we also have the olfactory area, meaning smell. Olfaction is smell. So hearing and smelling involved with the temporal lobe. Moving down, we have the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is where your visual areas are. So that's what's going to help you understand what you're seeing. Your eyeballs is what helps you see, right? It brings in light, but understanding that the tree is in the middle of the yard, or understanding that a car is coming at you, or you have to bring the book closer so you can read the book, that's the occipital lobe. And then last but not least is the insula. And the insula you can't see from the outer surface of the cerebrum. What we're going to have to do on the next slide is carve out a piece of the kind of the area where the temporal and the parietal area meet. And the insula is responsible for a little bit of memory, not solely just memory, but a little part of the memory, and also interpretation of gustation, or in other words, taste. So understanding what you're tasting. Is something salt? Is it sweet? Is it bitter? Is it spicy? All of those different types of taste sensations have to deal with the insula. So let's move on to the next slide and I'll show you what the insula actually looks like. If you take a look at this picture, on the left side will be the posterior part of the brain. So this is the occipital lobe area. And on the right side would be the anterior. So here is the frontal lobe. And what we did, as you can see, we carved out a big portion of the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, even the frontal lobe is carved out here. And you can see the colored portions is the insula. And we do have two insulas. We have one on the left and one on the right. You would just same thing. You'd have to carve part of the cerebrum out in order to see the insula. Once again, involved with memory and interpretation of taste. When looking at this picture for the first time, it can be pretty overwhelming and intimidating, but really all it is a map, just showing you where some of these specialized locations are. But know that there are billions of neurons in the brain, and all of them have their own specific function and their job to do. But these are just showing you some of the big highlights that we talked about on the previous slide. So let's discuss some of them. First, you can see the primary motor cortex here in this kind of green color. Remember, this is the frontal lobe, so if I was to highlight this frontal lobe for you in black. That would be the frontal lobe. Same thing here. It would kind of look like this on the right. So once again, this is the main area where the neurons are going to be designed to send action potentials down to the spinal cord, down out to the body to make your muscles move. That would be called the primary motor cortex, located in the frontal lobe. We have the primary somatosensory cortex. That's right behind the frontal lobe. And once again, that's going to be found in the parietal lobe. So this area right here helps you with touch sensation, understanding what's touching you. Then we have the primary auditory cortex. If you look at the very bottom left of the picture, or of the slide, right here, this is going to be found in that temporal lobe, helps you understand what you're hearing. And then we have the primary visual cortex in the very back of the brain, in the occipital lobe, helps you understand what you're seeing. So those specific gyri, that's their main job. Now we did talk about Broca's area. Broca's area, once again, is involved with motor function, but specifically it's involved with the muscles of your tongue, your mouth. It's also involved with just transmitting messages to help you speak. So this area is in the frontal lobe, Broca's area, F for frontal, and it's helping you with the generation of talking, or the making of the sound of the syllables and putting everything together. So it's not just talking, but it's making your talking make sense, if that makes sense. So if I say empty carton egg, right, that doesn't make sense because that's just a bunch of random words. But if I say the egg carton is empty, oh, well, now that makes sense. We need to go out and get some eggs, right? So that's what Broca's area helps you do. It just kind of helps you organize all of that. Now, another area that I didn't mention on the previous slide, but you do need to know, is Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area, highlighted right, or circled in the middle of the page right here, is this area kind of where the parietal and the temporal and the occipital area all kind of meet. I'll try to highlight it in blue for you. This whole area is Wernicke's area. And it's pronounced with a V. A lot of times it's a German word, so they say their letters a little differently. And this is responsible for language comprehension, so understanding language. So Broca's area in the frontal lobe is motor, helping you speak. And then Wernicke's, excuse me, I do that too. Wernicke's in the back is more sense, or understanding, comprehending what people are saying to you. Now, very important note that both of these areas in the majority of the population are only found on the left hemisphere. Only found on the left hemisphere. So as we continue our discussion here and we learn about the different anatomy, or the anatomical structures of the cerebrum, and we go down to the brainstem and how these axons move throughout the body, this is going to be really important because we're going to talk about injury. We're going to talk about what happens when you injure your brain, or what happens when you injure your spinal cord. And a really easy way of injuring your brain is direct trauma, right? Hit a blow to the head. But another very common way of injuring this tissue is some sort of stroke, where these tissues have a lack of oxygen for a certain amount of time, and the neurons die. So, in a left brain injury, that's very, very dangerous, especially if the area that's being affected is this speech area on the left side of the brain, the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. If those areas are damaged, you can have temporary loss of speech and language comprehension, or if they're completely damaged, where the cells just all died, you can have permanent loss of the ability to speak and permanent loss of the ability to comprehend language. So in the majority of the population, it's on the left side, both of these. Broca's area, generally 95% of the population has it on the left side, 5% has it on the right side. Everybody's a little different, right? So for the majority of the population, if somebody were to have a right-sided brain stroke, where the right side of the brain was affected, lack of oxygen for a certain amount of time, most cases, the language centers would be intact. And yes, even though they would have severe symptoms, we're going to talk about that, they would be paralyzed potentially on the left side of their body because the motor axons actually cross at the brainstem, we'll talk about. But the language would be fine. They'll be able to talk. They'll be able to comprehend you just fine after that kind of injury. So make sure you note that the Broca's and Wernicke's area is on the left side for the majority of the population. Now that we have the lobes of the brain down and their functions, let's talk about some of the structures that separate these different lobes. I've already discussed the longitudinal fissure. Remember, the longitudinal fissure is the very deep increase that separates the left brain from the right brain. And on the next two pictures, or the next two slides, I actually have even better illustrations of that. So we'll come back to that one. The central sulcus, also known as the central fissure, generally you'll hear central sulcus more commonly, is a very important one. It's right in the middle of the brain, and I'm going to draw it in black for you right here. And I want you to know that it's separating, this is a very important landmark, it's separating several different parts or functions of the brain. So first off, you need to tell me what lobes of the brain does the central sulcus separate. And what you should be telling me is the frontal lobe anteriorly and the parietal lobe posteriorly, right? Good, awesome. It also is, like I said, just right in the middle of the brain. It kind of just separates the anterior brain from the posterior brain. But what I want you to really focus and recognize is, remember that the frontal lobe is your motor areas. This is where you're going to move your muscles and help you speak. And then everything behind that, including the parietal lobe, is going to be sensory. So not only does the central sulcus separate frontal lobe from parietal lobe, it also separates the motor functions of the brain, the motor gyrus, from the sensory gyrus. Because if we were to get really nitty-gritty and look at the individual gyri, this one in green is helping you move, and then the one right next to it, separated by the central sulcus, is helping you feel. So they are separated by that indentation or that groove called the central sulcus. Next we have the lateral sulcus or the lateral fissure. Once again, a fissure is just a very big sulcus, so it just depends. Some books, some pictures call them different things interchangeably. I was always taught lateral sulcus, and as you can see in the picture, your book agrees, lateral sulcus. What this is the separation between the temporal lobe and the frontal and parietal lobes. So that black line right there. And this is just basically separating the temporal lobe from the other lobes, but also the superior half of the cerebrum to the inferior half of the cerebrum. And then last but not least, we have the parietal occipital fissure, also known as the parieto-occipital fissure sulcus. And it sounds just like it is. It separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and also the temporal lobe too. It's this whole thing right here. So basically just isolating the, kind of imitating that lambdoid or lambdoidal suture that we talked about. Once again, the longitudinal fissure is the deepest, and it separates the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. And what you'll notice is at certain parts, these hemispheres don't even touch one another. There's actually a really large space between the left and right brain. And let's move on to the next slide, and I'll show you what actually does connect them. Okay, so the structure is called the corpus callosum. And first I want to take your attention to the image on the right. And once again, you can see that big gap, that huge fissure separating the left and right hemisphere. They don't touch a lot. And what actually is connecting them is the corpus callosum, the structure. So you can see it from an anterior view on the right or the lateral view on the left, and it kind of makes this C looking shape. And what it does is, as I mentioned, it connects the left and right hemisphere together. Now, at this point in the brain, we have axons, myelinated axons, going in every direction, crossing from left to right and from right to left. So very important vocab word. Anytime in the nervous system where you have a crossing going on, where fibers are moving from one side to the other, what that's called is a commissure. And in this case, they're known as commissural tracts. I'll explain what a tract is in just a second. But a commissure is a place where we have crisscrossing from left to right and right to left. Now, what a tract is simply just bundles and bundles of axons in the central nervous system. So it's just going to be a lot of that white matter, just myelinated axons everywhere. So the corpus callosum allows that left brain to talk with the right brain. Whoops, get my left and right mixed up. There we go. So I mentioned the differences, a couple of the differences between left brain and right brain folks, right? If I'm really good at like math and logic thinking and science and stuff like that, maybe I'm more left brain. If I'm more creative, artistic, spatial thinking, that kind of thing, I'm more right brain. But think about somebody who plays a musical instrument using notes, right? And I'm going to butcher explaining this, but there is a number system to it, right? I remember learning in middle school there's a quarter note and a half note and a full note and a treble note or something like that. There is a number system to it. So when you are playing music, and you have all the different chords, right? You got D minor and E and F and G and all that. When you're playing music, you're not just using the right part of your brain. If there's any math or linear equation involved with the lyrics or the melody or anything, you are using the left brain too. You're just using more of the right is all. So how do these things communicate? How do they connect? How does that right brain, which is very different than the left brain, talk to one another? And it's through this. It's through the corpus callosum, through this commissural tract. So back in the day, when epileptic patients had a really hard time with their seizures and nothing worked, what they would do is either they would do a lobectomy, they would actually just remove a lobe of the brain, and other times they would actually do a corpus callosum removal. They would actually just cut this off, and what that would do is separate literally the left and right brain to where they couldn't communicate with one another. So a lot of times it's only one portion of the brain causing the seizures. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. So if the right brain is causing the right brain and the left brain to freak out and have these electrical misfirings, what they would do back in the day is they would remove this connection so the right brain couldn't communicate those bad electrical impulses to the left brain. And a lot of times they actually had pretty good success rates, believe it or not. But without a doubt, it did come with some side effects, right? Your left and right brain don't talk to one another, so that can be a dangerous side effect. So that's the corpus callosum. Recall back to last chapter when we talked about the difference between gray matter and white matter. Right, so let me draw you a neuron, and hopefully by now you should be able to tell me what type of neuron this is. Right, it's got about 7-8 dendrites and 1 axon. We can throw a axon, collateral axon on there as well. Why not? And your options, you should be telling me that this is either a unipolar, bipolar, or a multipolar neuron. And hopefully you're saying multipolar because it's got multiple appendages coming off of that cell body. So remember that the cell body and the dendrites generally are not myelinated whatsoever. They're naked, they're exposed, and what we called that was gray matter. If the neuron has any myelin to it, let's draw the myelin in yellow. If there is that fatty protective coating around it, we talked about that that's going to appear white under the microscope or under any type of scan, right? In this case, a CAT scan or an MRI, it's going to appear white. Fatty tissue is generally white. So we call that white matter. So anywhere in the brain, brainstem, or spinal cord where we have bundles and bundles of axons with myelin in them, they're going to appear in these white clumps or clusters. And anywhere where we don't have that, they're going to appear in these gray clumps or clusters. So what I want to do is direct your attention to the picture on the right and show you what I'm talking about here. On the very outside of the picture, if you actually just kind of trace the bone, you'll see that it's gray. And I'll just kind of put some dots all throughout the gray matter here. Gray, 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 all throughout the picture, right? But if you notice, as we go deeper into the picture, deeper into the brain, so what we're looking at is a frontal section of the brain, a frontal cut. So this would be the right side of the head. This would be like the right parietal bone right here. And then this would be the left side. As we look deeper into the brain, you start seeing some white matter, and I'll highlight the white matter with purple dots. Okay, so let's talk about the differences. The cerebral cortex, remember the cortex just refers to outside, or superficial. So the cortex generally is all gray matter. And the medulla refers to anything deep or inside, right? That medullary cavity in the bone, that's where the bone marrow was, deep inside the bone, near that, lined by that endosteum. Endo also means inside or within. So the medulla is going to be the white matter, or the deeper part of the brain. So notice you have this string of white matter actually connecting the right lobe to the left lobe. And once again, we just covered that that is the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is just this big highway of fibers from the right side going over the left and fibers from the left side going over the right, so the hemispheres can communicate with one another. So in reality, big picture, let's actually put the neurons to this image. Let's actually draw them and see what this looks like. What we actually have going on is in the gray matter, we have a bunch of cell bodies. So I'm kind of at the very top. Let me do this in, let's do this in red. How about that? I'm kind of at the top of the picture, and I'm just drawing a bunch of circles. I'm not going to draw the dendrites just to save your time, because I know your time is valuable. So what we have are just a whole bunch of cell bodies clumped in this gray area, and then what happens is the axons from those cell bodies extend into the deeper parts of the brain. And what you get is you just get these bundles and bundles and bundles of myelin inside this area. So the neurons on the outer surface of the brain, that's where the gray matter is, that's just called the cortex, and that's where the cell bodies and dendrites hang out. And then typically the axons go inward or deep into the brain tissue. So make sure you know the difference between the cortex and the medulla. The cortex is gray matter, the medulla is white matter. When we get to the spinal cord, we're going to get a little weird and flip-flop that order. Phenomenal picture here. I'm really glad your textbook put this picture in so you can actually see a live brain. Now, this brain, I mean, you can see the blood, so this is pretty fresh, pretty freshly removed. So there's a lot of pink to the color, but if you actually take a look at the section where they lopped off part of the frontal lobe here, so this is the frontal lobe because you can see the occipital lobe and the cerebellum in the back, so here's the anterior part of the brain. You can see part of this, and I'm highlighting in black, part of this brown grayish tissue. This would be the cortex. Now, once you drain all that blood and that thing's just sitting there for a little bit, it'll turn more grayish over time. And then you can really easily make out the white matter, right? That fatty tissue. And that kind of looks like fat, right? If you were to cut a chicken breast or a chicken thigh or something and trim the fat, that's what it looks like. That's what it appears like. It's just white, clumpy tissue. And that's what it is in your brain. But remember, that myelin is very beneficial. It's very helpful. The more myelin we have, the better and faster those nerve impulses, those action potentials can travel. And in your brain, you want your brain working fast, right? Especially if you're taking an anatomy and physiology test. So to reiterate what we just talked about, with the brain, with that cortex, all we're really looking at are clumps and clumps of cell bodies all bunched together. Now, of course, those cell bodies do have dendrites, right? And the dendrites are, for the most part, unmyelinated. But when you put all this tissue bunched up together like this, it makes your gray matter. Now, we're going to have different names for these clumps of gray matter depending on if we're talking about the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. And we did the same exact thing already with those glial cells, those myelin-making cells. Remember, last chapter we talked about the oligodendrocytes are the myelin-producing cells in the central nervous system. And we have a cell that's 99% identical to that in the PNS. But instead of calling it an oligodendrocyte, we call it a Schwann cell, right? It's pretty much the same thing. Not exactly identical, but pretty darn close. But we have different names for it based on where they're located. We're going to do the same thing with gray matter and white matter. So, in gray matter, with the brain, or with the spinal cord, or the brainstem, anywhere in the central nervous system, as you can see in your notes, what we're going to call that is a nucleus, or plural nuclei. So as we get into more detail, especially next semester when we start learning mechanisms of how the brainstem controls your heart rate and your blood pressure and your breathing, well, you'll see this more about either they're called nuclei or centers. And all they are just regions of gray matter, or islands of gray matter in the central nervous system. And they're just bundles and bundles or bunches and bunches of cell bodies and dendrites that are not myelinated. Now, it's the exact same anatomy in the PNS. It's just bundles of cell bodies and dendrites, but instead of calling it a nucleus or nuclei, what we call this is a ganglion, or plural, as you can see in the notes, ganglia. Now, I brought this picture on the bottom right for you just to kind of give you an idea of what a ganglion looks like. So the spinal cord is what's highlighted in black. I'm going to circle the spinal cord in black for all three pictures here. Alright, so remember, spinal cord is central nervous system. That's brain, brainstem, all that together. So that would still be considered nuclei, technically. But as soon as you leave the spinal cord, as soon as you go just lateral to the spinal cord, what we get are these clumps of cell bodies and dendrites. And as you can see in the picture, the label, this one's called the dorsal root ganglion. And what does that mean? Well, dorsal means posterior, and ganglion is just an area in the PNS where we have a lot of gray matter. We have a lot of cell bodies and dendrites bunched up together. And that's it. So make sure you know the difference between nuclei and ganglia. They're both cell bodies and dendrites, but one's in the CNS, one's in the PNS. Let's move on to the next slide. We're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to talk about white matter. We're going to have a different name for white matter in the central nervous system compared to white matter in the peripheral nervous system. And here are those names. In the central nervous system, in the brain, brainstem, spinal cord, what we're going to call them are tracts. And you saw this word before when we talked about the corpus callosum. It's called a commissural tract, right? Commissure means connecting left to right, right to left. And a tract is just a whole bunch of white matter. So these are the axons, because the axons are what's white matter. That's what's myelinated, right? So in this picture with the brain on top, that white stuff, you can say white matter, but they're also, more specifically, they're known as tracts. In the PNS, it gets a little more simpler. In the PNS, this is what we call nerves. Right? We have all sort of different nerves. We have radial nerve and an ulnar nerve and a femoral nerve and a sciatic nerve, right? All of those are just bundles and bundles of white matter, bundles and bundles of axons in the PNS. So you can see in this picture all of these yellow looking structures that are branching away or not exactly away, but they're branching off of the spinal cord because they're all motor and sensory, so they bring information too as well. But they're branching from the spinal cord. So because they're not part of the spinal cord, they are considered P and S. And you can also see a lot of them down here in the lumbar sacral region. So now, with this knowledge, is there such thing as a nerve inside of your brain? Or is there such thing as a nerve in your spinal cord? So if you have spinal cord compression, are you technically compressing nerves? And the answer is no. Nerves are only found in the PNS. So if you pinch a nerve, you are pinching something outside of your brainstem spinal cord. You're pinching something in the peripheral nervous system. If we're talking about white matter axons in the CNS, they're called tracts. And I'll point that out in more detail as we learn more of the neuroanatomy. All right, so what I would encourage you to do is make a little chart. Make a little 4x4 chart to make sure you don't flip these, because these would make a great multiple choice question, right? Which of the following are gray matter in the PNS? A, B, C, D. You got 4 choices. So what I would do is I would say I would make CNS over here, and then PNS over here, and then I would say cell bodies and dendrites, the non-myelinated stuff over here, and then I would say axons over here, and then just make a chart. So in the CNS, we called those nuclei, and then tracts were the axons. In the PNS, we called them ganglion. Oh, and then I guess this would, so nerve here, we'll say nuke there. There we go. And maybe that chart will help you, I don't know. But make sure you know the difference between these 4 terms. You're going to see this on your upcoming exam. You'll also see this on the final. All right, so we've covered the cerebrum. Now what we're going to do is move inward or medially to the core of the brain. And that core is called the diencephalon. And that's actually what this word translates to. It's basically the central core of the brain. So in this picture, you're looking at a mid-sagittal cut right down the middle of the brain, and then we're just flipping it to look at it laterally. So you're looking at the very mid portion of the brain, and if you don't believe me, you can take a look for yourself. There is our corpus callosum, right? Our commissure right in the middle of the brain, connecting the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, and right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. So what we're looking at here with the diencephalon specifically is anything that has the word thalamus in it. So you can see here's a thalamus, here is a hypothalamus, and we're also going to have something called the epithalamus as well. So the thalamus is this green looking structure here, circled in red. The hypothalamus makes sense, it's right underneath the thalamus. And then the epithalamus is just an area kind of around the thalamus and hypothalamus area. And also this structure here in black, I'll draw an arrow. There we go. That's going to be called the pineal gland, and just a little bit part of the epithalamus. So very, very center core of the brain. Not the brainstem though. This area in purple right here, this is going to be the brainstem. This is going to be a different part of the central nervous system. So right now we're just talking about anything with the word thalamus in it. So let's begin with the actual thalamus. And the thalamus has many different roles, many different functions. On the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you all of those multiple features. But this is the main one, folks, right here at the bottom of the page. Relays sensory information to the cerebral hemispheres, specifically the lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. So pretty much everything except smell has to go through this structure, the thalamus. And the thalamus is what routes it to its proper destination. And you guys actually already know how to do this, the route of the thalamus. So say that something is touching your arm, right? Let's take a look at this picture on the left. Say that something is touching your arm. A bug climbs on you, right? And you feel that sensation. That message, that action potential has to climb up your arm, go up your spinal cord, and then what it does is it goes up your brainstem and it arrives at the thalamus. And the thalamus is basically the central airport, the central hub, or like the main UPS center, right? If we live in a small town, when we mail something to another state, it has to go to the big post office first. So it goes from the small town to the big city, and then from the big city it'll go to another big city or its final destination. Kind of the same thing here. The thalamus is going to route the specific sense. It's going to compute or calculate what sense we're talking about and then send it to the proper destination. So let's go back to our example, a bug crawling on you. If a bug's crawling on you, that is our touch sensation. So what lobe of our cerebral cortex, or what lobe of the brain, detects touch? And hopefully your answer will be the parietal lobe. So it's going to send it right in this area. And that's what the thalamus does. See that somebody shines a bright light in your eye. The bright light is a stimulus. It goes to your eye, and then it has to go to the thalamus. So here's the bright light. Here's our eyeball. Bright light comes to the eye. That message eventually gets to the thalamus, and the thalamus is going to send it to our visual center. Where's our visual center? What lobe? The occipital lobe. Very good. And then it does the same thing for auditory and for gustation. It basically is the main router that sends it to its final area. Now let's move on to the next page and we'll talk about some other not so major functions, but still important functions of the thalamus. But at the end of the day, this is the most important function of the thalamus. It relays pretty much all sensory information to the final destination. So the top bullet point is basically what I just said, the major relay station or the major airport, right? If you live, same thing, if you live in a suburb or a small town and you want to go to New York City, you got to go to the major airport to fly to New York City. You're not going to fly out of your small town. And that's what the thalamus is. It's the major airport hub. And then you can see the second bullet, it produces crude awareness, which is basically just general sensation. The cerebral cortex interprets sensations, right? The parietal lobe is interpreting touch. The temporal lobe is interpreting auditory and olfaction. And then we have the occipital lobe with vision, right? But just kind of general basic sensations. The thalamus also helps communicate with the cerebrum and just gives you an idea of what's going on around your body. Other functions of the thalamus. It does play a role with something called our limbic system, which is basically our emotional center. So it does play a role with emotions. And because it's constantly sending messages to the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe with all of these different stimuli, it does play a small role in keeping us awake with arousal. But it's not the main one. Remember, the main job is to just route the messages. Okay, we're going to have a different part of our central nervous system that keeps you awake, keeps you from falling asleep right now. And then we're also going to be involved with some reflexes as well, but we'll talk same thing. We'll talk about other parts of the central nervous system that kind of specialize in reflexes. So again, you can see in this picture, really cool MRI. You can see the thalamus circled in red. And the main function is to route those messages to wherever they need to go. So let's do maybe red will work. There we go. So whether it's the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, wherever we're going, wherever sensation we're feeling, that's where it's going to be sent. Moving inferiorly, we arrive at the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus does all sorts of cool, crazy things. Just take a look at the stuff in bold. Regulates body temperature, regulates how much water is in your body, and therefore, in a way, regulates how much blood is floating around in your body in urine. Regulates your metabolism, your center for drives and emotions, such as your hunger drive, your sex drive comes from the hypothalamus. As you can see with emotions, your thirst, pain, pleasure, just hundreds of different things. The hypothalamus is just multifaceted, really, really cool. Here's the big thing we need you to know for the hypothalamus this semester, right now at least. how does it do all this? How does it regulate body temperature and how much water I have and our hunger levels and metabolism and all that? The hypothalamus is basically your capital for your endocrine system. Now, if you go back all the way to chapter 1, first day of class, we talked about the two major organ systems that play a role in homeostasis. And of course, the nervous system, right? Your brain controls everything. But your brain controls everything through two systems. The nervous system, which was that fast, really rapid and short-lasting effect. And then the endocrine system, which is kind of that slower but longer lasting effect. Right? Because hormones travel through the bloodstream, it takes a little bit longer to get to where it needs to go compared to electricity. So the hypothalamus is your main center for hormones. And those hormones control all sorts of other different glands that control your hormones, such as your thyroid and your pancreas and your testes and ovaries and adrenal glands, and the list goes on and on. So the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system is through the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland hangs just right below the hypothalamus. And a lot of textbooks and a lot of websites and stuff will say the pituitary gland is the master gland of the endocrine system. And I always disagreed with it. I never liked that, because what's controlling the pituitary gland? Well, the hypothalamus is controlling the pituitary gland. So who's really in charge of all this is the hypothalamus. So, how does this stuff work? How are things like oxytocin, which is a drug or a hormone that is secreted when a female is giving birth to squeeze on that uterus or to cause those contractions and let the baby come out? How does it hold on to water? And how do we make stuff like growth hormone and develop our sperm and our eggs and our testes and ovaries? And how do we grow facial hair and armpit hair and all that stuff? Well, there's two mechanisms. There is a direct route, and that just means that the hypothalamus makes the hormones, right? If it's the capital of hormone land, it makes sense that the hypothalamus actually synthesizes some hormones. And those hormones regulate other hormones elsewhere in the body. Another way is indirectly. For example, growth hormone is made actually in the anterior pituitary gland. So growth hormone is actually not made, and this is what that APG means right here, anterior pituitary. So growth hormone, really cool hormone, right? It helps you grow, helps your muscles get bigger, your bones get bigger, your cartilage, your tendons, your ligaments, your skin, everything grows when growth hormone is released. Very important to make sure that you grow up into an adult-sized human being. But the anterior pituitary gland is what makes growth hormone, but what's controlling how much growth hormone is released? You know, we don't want to be 2 feet tall, right? We don't want to be, and the proper term is a dwarf. I'm not being mean, but dwarfism is the proper anatomical term if you're under, I think, 4 feet tall. But we don't want to be 8'9" either, right? Because then our heart's going to explode because it can't keep up with our body. So we want to be somewhat I don't know, average height, but we want to be not too tall, not too short to those extremes. So something has to control it. And guess what? The hypothalamus controls it. So yes, even though the anterior pituitary gland releases growth hormone, what's controlling how much growth hormone is made and released is the hypothalamus. So hormones, hormones, hormones. We're going to talk more about this in chapter 15. We're also going to obviously talk about this more in the endocrine system. So here's some really neat images just showing you more detail what the hypothalamus looks like and where it's oriented, where it's located. So if I was to show you, maybe white will work. In white, I'm currently coloring the thalamus on the image on the left, the MRI on the left. You can see the corpus callosum with the arrows pointing to it. Very cool. And the hypothalamus is this area with the red arrow. So it makes sense, the hypothalamus being below the thalamus. If you look at the picture on the right, you'll see how the hypothalamus connects to the pituitary gland. So we have an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. And it's basically held by this thing called the infundibulum, which is basically a stalk. It's just kind of this branch, if you will, that holds it together. and the pituitary gland just kind of hangs in it. And where does the pituitary gland actually settle so it's protected? Well, you've learned about it. It's in that weird butterfly bone called the sphenoid bone. And that saddle, that groove right in the middle of the sphenoid bone, is called what? The sella turcica. Exactly, yes, of course. The sella turcica, right? And that's where that pituitary gland hangs out and is nice and protected. So that's why we made you learn that. Now it's all starting to come together. Wait till we talk about the cribriform plate and the crista galli in just a little bit with the ethmoid bone. There's a reason why we made you learn all those weird structures. So we've covered the thalamus, we've covered the hypothalamus. Let's move on to the pineal gland or the pineal body. This is part of what we call the epithalamus. So it's just on the outside, and more specifically posterior to the thalamus. And this is a gland. It does secrete a hormone, so a lot of times it's called the pineal gland. Other times it's called the pineal body. Same thing. You'll hear me say both. So the reason why it's called pineal is because it looks like this little kind of pine cone looking thing. So they just named it that. And it's located right above the corpora quadrigemina, which is a really weird, long name of something. We'll talk about that in just a moment. It's just part of the brainstem. So the pineal gland, in case you can't see it in the picture, this tiny little thing right there. Draw another arrow from superior to inferior. There we go. Little purple dot. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about what it does. So the pineal gland has two main functions. Number one, it regulates our biological clock, which basically just helps our cells stay on kind of an on-off cycle. Lets you know when it's time to go to bed, when it's time to eat. And as you can see, it also helps regulate the 28-day cycle for the female reproductive system. All the changes that goes on in the ovaries and the changes with the menstrual cycle and the uterus are regulated by this part of your brain. And other parts too, but the pineal gland plays a role. And the second function it does is it secretes a hormone, and that's why it's called a gland, pineal gland, because glands secrete things, right? Like a sweat gland secretes sweat. So the hormone is called melatonin. And melatonin is the sleepy drug that your body naturally makes. So as it gets dark outside, your brain, specifically your pineal gland, starts secreting this drug, literally this hormone, and it makes you sleepy. Now the problem with us in America today is we like to inhibit this melatonin. Back in the day, go back several hundred years ago before electricity, when it got dark out, it got dark out. Unless you were financially well off and you could afford candles or, lanterns, when it's dark, it's pitch dark out and you had to go to bed. With today's society, we turn the lights on, we turn the TV on, we have the cell phone, the computers, the iPads, the iPhones, the iWhatevers, and that can inhibit melatonin. So a lot of times folks with sleep issues, what they tell you to do is just shut down everything, shut down all the lights, get some really heavy-duty blinds to block out any sun or moonlight or street lights, and you'll be amazed on how that will actually help you sleep. So that's the pineal gland.